Great. Thank you, Giancarlo. And thanks to each of you for sharing what your organizations are doing. There are index cards around the room. If folks want to ask a question, I would ask you to fill out an index card and we'll come and pick it up from you. I want to reflect a little bit on something that Eliza said, which I think has been borne out as we've listened to each of you speak, and that is that we've built a lot of muscle to be able to take these fights on, that this isn't something that just kind of snuck up on us and we were unprepared. There is institutional power that's been built. We've also made a lot of forward progress in terms of creating safe spaces for students. And so I have a question here about whether or not you have seen whether you have seen an increase in these kind of disturbing negative experiences that students have reported anecdotally. Has your organization actually picked up on this? I know that, Eliza, you gave us a chart, but it stops at 2015.
Yes.
So are you either anecdotally or statistically seeing an uptick in these kinds of incidents in schools? And then what advice do you have for teachers about how to take proactive steps, either working with your organizations or with others, to help their students be in a safe space?
Shall I start? Yes. Okay. Well, yes. Yes, unfortunately, the answer is yes. And I think what's interesting for us is that we're looking at a couple of different dimensions of what's happening. I think, anyone who works in a school setting or who works with youth knows that part of the dynamic of groups of children is that they're going to test the limits and that people are going to, bullying is a dynamic that can be disrupted, but it's pretty, you're never going to eradicate it. It's just how well you respond to it. I think we've seen an uptick in two things. Students themselves testing the limits with each other and mirroring language that they're hearing either at home or on the news, to our great shame as a country, and then institutional discrimination that I think, unfortunately, in a lot of different ways, we've seen very specifically coming up in pointed ways. So let me give an example and then just what teachers themselves can do. So an example of each, what we've seen among students is a definite uptick in incidents of use of language, testing those limits, the idea of calling someone a faggot or a tranny or a freak. And that's been particularly pointed for transgender youth because those students have been specifically targeted by the federal government in terms of the rescission of guidance that has been so important that was issued last year by the Department of Education and the Department of Justice. That was one of the first things that our new Attorney General decided to do, was to take away guidance that was providing clarity and support to students in school districts across the country in a cloud of invented fears and dangers. We're seeing that on the student side. And on the institutional side, I'm afraid to tell you that the official action has given people a sense of a license to discriminate. GLSEN has chapters in communities all across the country, and in at least 3 communities, we knew that, back in February, on Wednesday, the guidance was in place. It was rescinded Wednesday evening, and on Thursday, students who had been using appropriate facilities with no problems were told they could no longer use those facilities. Even though their rights under Title IX remain, the law has not changed. The only thing that has changed is that this administration has decided to proactively say, oh, you remember what we said about what that law means? We take it back. For the population that GLSEN is particularly focused on, LGBTQ youth, who of course then are also drawn from all these other communities, there is still, despite the progress we've seen, a baseline of risk that is very, in terms of mental health and risk behaviors, as well as experiences of discrimination, that I think is particularly important for teachers to bear in mind. LGB youth were just included in the National Youth Risk Behavior Survey for the first time by the CDC in 2015. We are now seeing trans questions being asked in the YRBS that's in the field now. But I need to just underscore, despite the progress we've seen, LGBT youth from all communities do worse in every category that the federal government currently monitors in terms of risk behaviors, self-harm, and mental health challenges, suicidality. And these risks are compounded if these students are not white, and if these students come from communities are being targeted in other ways as well. So I always want teachers to know there's a basic fact about school climate, culture, and individual student health. For an LGBT student, being able to identify one supportive educator in the school environment, one supportive adult, whether it's a teacher, a nurse, a counselor, that can save their life. It's not rocket science. There's an aspect of this that is just showing up for students. And I bet you that there's a similar protective effect if it's a documented or undocumented student, if it's an Arab student or a student who's being perceived to be Muslim and targeted as a terrorist. So that's why I've included in your packet the Safe Space Kit and Ready, Set, Respect, simple ways that a teacher can be visible to students as a source of support. And our Safe Space Kit then is designed, there's the step of being that one person. But the fact is that if you get 6 or more supportive educators in a school environment, you begin to see a change in school culture. So our Safe Space Kit gives you some resources and information about being that one visible educator, but then some thoughts about how to reach out and work with your colleagues to begin to advance changes across the school. If you don't feel able, if you are in a hostile environment where you do not feel able to be visible, there are other things you can do. And we've found, evaluating the impact of the kit, that 90% of teachers who receive this kit, even including those who are in a place so hostile that they can't put up a safe space sticker, they've taken some action to advocate for a policy, to reach out to their colleagues, to put something into a lesson plan. Those things can really make an enormous difference. And those impacts are amplified when you're dealing with students who are dealing with a cross-cutting intersection of risks in their life. So the upside on taking an action like that is so huge, and it's something that I know for many teachers has been a life-changing experience. When they have a conversation with a trans student or an LGBT student and they know what a difference they've made, it's really become a source of greater power for them.
Thank you.
What ADC has seen, especially on January 27th, after the Arab and Muslim ban was implemented, there was an outpouring of support, which was, I don't think the administrator expected, but was greatly needed. On the other side, there was also those opposing and negative protests. So throughout the country, there were also protests that were done in front of schools, telling students and demanding that principals identify Arabs and Muslims who are in their school and send them back to Saudi Arabia or wherever they came from, right? And so we saw that impact. And so these protests also create this same environment of feeling unsafe and unwelcomed. But it's also tied to the aspects of schools actively or even, involuntarily working with ICE. Right? And so not taking the position to firmly oppose and prohibit ICE roundups at schools. Under this current administration, the sensitive places memorandum, in which included schools and churches and mosques and health facilities where the roundups would not occur, are now occurring. And schools play a vital role in ensuring that does not happen. And this has been tied to the mass roundup of Somalis throughout the country, who majority of them came here and sought asylum and were denied, but have been here for 10, 15, 20 years. And so essentially, it's creating that aspect again that these people are criminals, and this is occurring at school facilities and playgrounds and surrounding areas. And so school administrators and districts and teachers can take an active role in opposing those type of actions and working through their city councils and their local law enforcement departments to ensure that this doesn't happen. We also, of course, are seeing, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of increased bullying. But a lot of this bullying is also tied to one, of course, the political rhetoric, but essentially also hate incidents. Generally, in districts in which hate incidents are not adequately enforced by law enforcement or not even reported, large areas like Chicago and Miami still report no hate crimes across the branch under the Hate Crime Statistics Act. And so in those particular same areas where they're also large citywide areas with mass populations, you see an increase in also these hate incidents around schools. And so, for instance, there's been the Nazi sign put on students' lockers. Throughout schools for persons who were even perceived to be Arab but were not. They were Spanish, but they were treated that way because of that. And then lastly, another issue that we've seen, we worked hard with the Department of Education to issue guidance and memorandum, which is also included in your packet, on how educators can handle discrimination complaints that are filed by students or their parents themselves in the education setting. And so making sure that there's a robust, active grievance process in your school is also important, but also ensuring that grievance process is not used as an abuse mechanism. Often I get involved in a lot of Title VII OCR complaints because they are being misused and abused as a harassment tool. Right, where students have numerous complaints filed against them because they're exercising their First Amendment right to be vocal about some controversial issues about Israel, about the war, about Syria, etc. And they're being told they're creating a hostile environment by exercising their First Amendment right to speak on these issues, whether it's in classrooms, whether it's by wearing a shirt. We've also seen it in the African American community, which we work closely with, wearing a Black Lives Matter shirt and things of that nature, where complaints are filed against them. And these students are essentially bullied into conforming into the status quo or the ideal of perception that the school wants to follow. And so these incidents, when an administration also feels pressured, creates that environment where students feel they can do what they want to each other, and there won't be any repercussions or actions taken by the administration.
I'll be brief since I know we probably have other questions, but deportations didn't just start under President Trump. President Obama deported over 2.5 million immigrants, so that's over 2.5 million families. So that type of fear is not new. That type of criminalization is not new. What is new is more rhetoric coming from the White House itself, and there's a lot more fear. In terms of examples, we are already getting reports of, even just in New Jersey, of families being picked up while they're waiting outside for their kids to come out of school, right? And then that ties into another part of what the work that we're now forced to do, which is kind of what we hate to do, is doing power of attorney presentations now, where we have to work with families to sign over like a legal form saying that if something happens to me, if I get deported or detained, that my sister or my child's aunt or uncle or whoever can have legal custody of my child. Because otherwise, if the child comes home and the parent has been detained, deported, or whatever happens, they would just get picked up by DYFS and get put into the foster care system. So it's a terrible thing that we have to do and educate our community on. Unfortunately, it's necessary, because that is what's happening right now, right? Like, these families are getting taken apart and this has happened in New Jersey. We're now hearing, and I'm sure some of you all have heard of people with DACA, with deferred action childhood arrivals, actually being deported and or detained from across the country. Even, the case yesterday of our student who has DACA and was even called in for a meeting with an immigration enforcement officer. And institutionally, this stuff is getting worse. DACA rejection rates have gone up to like 25%. So even the administration has already gotten USCIS, United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, to already be more strict on people renewing for some sort of protection status. So those things are happening, and what we do is, we'll definitely more than willing to partner with y'all or connect you with other resources, even for the educators watching it online, to figure out how we can, try to send some pro bono attorneys, some national partners over to y'all, try to see what we can do to help out the families there, do know your rights, and figure out what other steps and precautions unfortunately need to happen, and even do screenings, right? Because a lot of, I promised I'd be brief, sorry. Some of the cases where we're even hearing is, refugees, recent arrivals, who might be eligible for some sort of special immigrant juvenile status or U visa or VAWA or what have you, all these random immigration terms where they might, because of what they face on their journey here or once they've arrived here, they might qualify for some form of legal relief and help, but they'll never get access to that because attorneys are super expensive and many of them might be too afraid to go to one. So we can partner with an institution, and we've done this with schools. We've done this trainings with counselors on their professional development days where we can teach them, these are the basics, these are the attorneys in your area you can contact, these are the clinics, the national orgs that can come in and do free legal screenings and intakes and support to see if we can get some form of legal protection for your students and or their parents, right? So I'll leave that question at that.
Thank you very much. You're anticipating a lot of the questions that people are asking, so you're not going too long at all. I'm going to take the liberty, since Mary Catherine Ricker is not going to be able to join us, to answer the question I just asked you from the perspective of the AFT and just share a little bit about what the AFT has been doing in this area. I want to particularly highlight the work we've been doing with our local affiliates and members around the issue of immigrant students. We know that it is certainly true that President Obama was the deporter-in-chief, but the tone of the new administration and the sort of randomness of attacks on communities has taken a lot of people off guard. I know in my own city of Austin, Texas, where we had a very visible sheriff announce that we were going to have sanctuary type of arrangement. Really what she was doing was legally just not honoring ICE detention requests from ICE authorities in the jail. But the reaction to her from the federal level was that we were one of the cities that was visited by one of these kind of flash immigration actions. And fortunately, we have a local affiliate there that for years has been doing work building relationships with the immigrant community, conducting DACA clinics, even doing naturalization work. And AFT has prepared materials, and these really predate the new administration, but these have been built into a more robust tool for our local affiliates to be able to train members on how to work directly with their students and their students' parents. And there was something, Eliza, that you said that was interesting. You kind of targeted the school management folk to say, hey, you run the schools, you should be the ones setting these standards. And we've done that. We've gone to school districts and gotten them to adopt safe schools resolutions. But in the case of Austin, our members were out in front of the school district. Mm-hmm. And when the ICE raids started happening, the phones started ringing, and that weekend, hundreds of teachers showed up to be trained on what to do and say when their students and their parents come to the school. And at one point, the school district actually tried to quash it because they were uncertain and feeling nervous. And so our local affiliate held a press conference, got the mayor, got city council members, got school board members, basically got enough of the community standing behind them saying, we are not going to allow kids to be terrorized in our schools, and all we are doing is providing people with information about their legal rights under our current system. And the school district eventually backed off and now is cooperating again. working with our members. And I think, you know, you all have raised a couple of things that I want to highlight that are strategies that you seem to be using. One is this whole notion of not acquiescing, right? It's very intimidating for people when folks in authority come in and start telling you what to do, even when you know it's wrong, right? Giancarlo, you mentioned, you know, school districts starting to request information from students that they clearly had no business asking for, right? But it's an authority, so being willing to not just go along is a really big takeaway for me. Eliza, your point about standing up, about, you know, not being quiet and recognizing that, you know, I'm very struck by the information that you shared about one of the leading indicators about school safety is when you have a group of adults that work at the school that have committed to each other that they're going to support one another in creating a safe space, and the impact that that has. It isn't institutional per se, but it's individuals acting and making a huge difference. And then I think the notion about institutions being protected also, whether it's the law itself being honored. You know, each of us represents an organization, an institution that has built power, and we know our own institutions are under attack because we stand up for kids and families. And being aware of that and being willing to come to the aid one to the other, I think is something that you know you all have really lifted up for me. So there is another question. What are the legal remedies available to parents and students if their school experience is hostile or discriminating?
You want to start down there?
Sure. Well, I definitely don't want to take too long on this one because a lot of it is what I mentioned. And you know, for example, partnering up with AFT and bringing in those not only community members and leaders like the mayor and such, who, you know, they can encourage the mayor to vote to make their city a sanctuary city. But we also are trying to look, or at least like redefine that, in terms of sanctuary city being not just about immigration, but making sure that sanctuary means, you know, no stop and frisk, making sure that the city police force acknowledges that Black Lives Matter, right? Making sure that it's safe for LGBT spaces, and making sure that it's safe for the intersection of people dealing with all these different identities, right? And that's something that, you know, neither of these are like you're either one or the other of the issue, right? There are people who experience multiple of these identities and discriminations all in a variety of ways, and not just at school, but, you know, a lot of it starts up at home. So one of the ways is, you know, we have these model resolutions here in your packet that y'all can look at. I'm sure it'll be online for the folks who are tuning in online, but also making sure we bring in attorneys to do free screenings and intakes, because while a person might end up not being eligible for DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, during the intake process, a student or even their parent can learn that they might be eligible for another form of legal protection, whether it be TPS, SIDGE. They found out they had a petition at one point that made them eligible for a green card, or their marriage ended up being to a citizen. They didn't realize that that's a way they can legalize their status. So there are different variety of ways. I'm not an attorney, so that's my legal disclosure. I can't give legal advice, but I would encourage the local community members to connect with legal help, accredited attorneys, to make sure that they provide their students at least a way to get some form of legal protection and help.
Well, I am an attorney, but I still have to give a disclaimer because we haven't signed the retainer agreement. But I will say one way in which we have a model is also included in the packet, which ADC also includes 3 different sample lesson plans, as well as incorporating and addressing curriculum and textbook issues. But one way is to ensure and revise your privacy policies in schools. We have a sample language that's included, which essentially mandates and requires a warrant. Often, a lot of these not all of them, there's some good ones, but often ICE officers or immigration officers come and just demand information. The school just gives it over. You don't have to do that. Believe it or not, it once people are in the United States, they are here physically in the United States. I'm not talking about at the airport. They have rights, even though they're not U.S. citizens, even though they're not green card holders. Secondly, one also way is to ensure and modify your internet policies and monitoring mechanisms. Often, a lot of schools have monitoring mechanisms to make sure students are not watching inappropriate content and violence and etc. Make sure that these companies that you have contracted with are also have those protections and rights and are willingly giving your information and data over to law enforcement. You can stipulate that in your contracts with these institutions. Also, ADC has chapters throughout the country with our largest and strongest in Arab population hub centers, of course, like Texas, Florida, Michigan, California, Chicago, and in the DMV, New York, New Jersey area. But we do provide pro bono assistance in these aspects. And in light of the Arab and Muslim ban on January 27th, our organization, along with the Immigration Refugee Assistance Project, ACLU, the list can go on, we've all sued, we have built a network of attorneys that we have trained throughout the country to take on these cases to address these issues. So if you really have an issue or a question, now we have the attorneys who are doing these cases pro bono, but also who are now essentially trained advocates. And this is going to be an ongoing dedication and research that ADC and other organizations do to ensure that even corporate attorneys and criminal attorneys, they know what's going on so that we can send someone out in a minute if necessary.
And I would just say, if you're checking on your monitoring software for filtering in schools, please know that most filtering software will filter out lesbian and gay content of any kind as well, and you should check for that. GLSEN's website is often rendered inaccessible because of filtering software on, lesbian is a code word for porn, in case you didn't know that. That's often set as a, anyway, it's something to check for. In terms of legal remedies, one thing I will say it out loud here, although I'm sure most of you are aware, but LGBT people do not have consistent anti-discrimination protections across this country. My father didn't really believe that when I used to tell him that there were lots of places I could be fired just for being a lesbian. But let's remember that is the case. Although what is changing, and what we saw in the guidance on Title IX, certainly in schools, Title IX protections on the basis of sex are now generally understood, and this is still working its way through the courts, but the decisions have been very consistent to cover transgender people and increasingly to cover lesbian and gay and bisexual people as well. So within schools, there are federal legal protections, and that's what the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education was acting on in responding to painful and egregious cases of discrimination that were brought to OCR for investigation and disposition. Title IX is still in place. We don't know how the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Education will now respond, but certainly we've actually seen cases completed, investigations completed, and settlements reached since January 20th that were initiated before, where trans students and LGBT students have gotten relief from OCR. But beyond that, I would also just mention that there are 55 million school children in the U.S., 55 million students across the country, K through 12. 24 million of them go to school in states that have state-level bullying prevention laws that require LGBT-inclusive bullying prevention policies at the school level, providing one powerful basis for individual action, which, as I absolutely agree, is the vanguard life-saving thing that we need to see. And about 22 million go to school in states where state law has anti-discrimination protections for LGBT students and LGBT people throughout the state. So those are two very important things to remember. There are arcs of good practice. I'm beginning to think of them. As we look now at continued progress at the state level, there are state level protections that we need to ensure are being fully implemented down to the district and school level across those states. So I'll leave it at that for the moment, but those protections are there. There are federal protections, but the question, of course, is always in how are those lived out and how are those laws interpreted. But in a moment when our institutions, our laws, and our very values are under attack, there is a very powerful role for every single individual in a school environment to play in standing up for those values. And during this Teacher Appreciation Week, let us never, ever underestimate the power of that individual commitment in a child's life.
Thank you for that. Eliza, this question, I think, is for you. President Obama and other stars participated in a program called It Gets Better to help LGBTQ kids that were going through rough patches. From your perspective, yes, I'm sorry. The question is about the program It Gets Better, which former President Obama and a number of high-profile Americans participated in, helping LGBTQ kids get through rough patches. Was it helpful from your perspective, and are there other programs or interventions out there, or is this still an ongoing project?
There is absolutely no question that the visibility of public figures willing to say, for example, we see you, we hear you, and we will do everything in our power to protect you moving forward. I mean, Loretta Lynch's words in releasing the guidance last year, the It Gets Better videos, the power of individuals coming out themselves, we just see it so consistently in our research. Students who can identify a supportive adult, whether that's someone directly in their life or a public figure, have an ally in their lives, and that makes an enormous, enormous difference. So I would never, ever poo-poo that. I think what that then can turn into in terms of a student's sense of self and sense of place within the community is absolutely invaluable. You know, we started talking about what's happened since the election and what we've seen. I alluded to, of course, that Southern Poverty Law Center project of collecting stories from teachers across the country. They collected about 10,000 reports from teachers about what was going on in schools. The other thing they did was then ask, okay, so how has your school responded and what things have been positive to deal with what's been happening? One of the interventions I mentioned was the presence of a student club known as a Gay Straight Alliance. Well, my colleague Maureen Costello at the Southern Poverty Law Center's Teaching Tolerance program told me a couple of months ago the most consistent response that they saw was a GSA reaching out to other community groups within the school and using it as a base for organizing. The other piece of the puzzle is that when you provide that example for a student, when you provide that sense of inclusion, they will act to preserve their community as well. GLSEN is so proud to partner with student advocates and to be powered by student advocates across the country, either as GSA leaders or as individuals taking part in events like the GLSEN Day of Silence, which happens every April. Students out there want to be part, and belonging makes an enormous difference. So those videos were extremely important. It's also good to remember, you know, when President Obama came into office, he didn't support gay marriage. You know, there's been a lot of evolution that has happened over the last decade, and it's been very powerful. So all the teachers and AFT members out there, I'd say the other thing that you can do that would be extremely, extremely important would be to step up and be willing to serve as a GSA advisor. Students tell us that particularly at a time like this when people are frightened, one of the big barriers to them forming a GSA, which is their right under the Equal Access Act, is finding a member of the faculty who's willing to be an advisor. Of course, there are concerns about personal jeopardy. Faculty have been disciplined fired GSA advisors often usually don't get the same compensation as other advisors, something we need to keep looking at. But that is a sort of next step way to really stand with your students to make a difference.
Great, thank you. Another question regarding resources for immigrant and refugee students. The Department of Health and Human Services has in the past offered grants to school districts and states that receive an influx of refugees or immigrants to offer services, including to help acclimate. Are these grants still available, do we know?
They're available, but with a caveat, kind of, and that's why we don't recommend educators seek them. As was discussed earlier, it's a big push about these counter-violent extremism programs, and so a lot of the grants now are being couched under CVE, and yes, we need to assimilate these people because they're violent, right? If not, they're going to do something. And so it just feeds that stereotype. And so these grants come with caveats of reporting mechanisms and the creation of programs, which in our view and assessment violates HIPAA protections, particularly when you're forcing or seeking notes or personal confidential communications with counselors or other health officials in the education school system. But also in our view, it also may potentially violate even under the OCR's enforcement of Title VII, which they is reframed as Title VI for the Department of Education. OCR enforcement of discrimination based on national origin, race, or color. The issue with that is that often they say, well, it doesn't include religion, right? But the Department of Education has issued out guidance stating that religious aspects can still be enforced if they represent significant cultural prejudice, right? And so the religious aspects that are based upon a region, an ethnic, the MENA region can still be protected under the OCR for basis of national origin. So I would be highly wary of applying for these grants because they require working with law enforcement and require monitoring and reporting. With no protections for civil rights or civil liberties.
All right. I'm going to ask folks to kind of give some concluding comments. And in doing that, I would ask you to think about what are the next steps that we can and should be taking together to continue to ensure that schools are safe, welcoming, environments for students. So next steps, either from the perspective of your own organization or the work that we're doing together.
There's been so much put forth here in so many different ways right now that the students we all seek to serve are facing real pressures and assaults on their lives and dignity and the opportunity that we're all seeking to secure for them. You know, I think I would just leave it with this. I was really struck back when the Ferguson Commission put out their report. I really appreciated the fact, Brittany Packnett, who served on the Ferguson Commission, made sure that the whole child approach to education was framed in that report as one of the most important ways that the schools of Ferguson could help to mitigate the impact of the poverty and discrimination that students in Ferguson face every day. So there's something for me at this time of really dramatic challenge about coming back to core values, about serving the whole child, about seeing every child in your classroom for who they are and all the dimensions of their identities and all of the vulnerabilities that those identities create to both institutional and individual bad action. And I think really for us, again, time of dramatic challenge, our most important core project is to stand up for the idea that every child that comes before us is endowed with their creator, by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And among those rights for those of us who care about schools is that they be seen and loved and respected and affirmed for who they are. Because with that whole child framework, that is the business of schools and the real business of education and the project that will save us all. And as the daughter of a teacher myself, I have unbounded respect for the people who do their jobs every day and go in and try to meet students where they are. And I'm really grateful to all of you and to the entire membership of the AFT for that and for the 27 years of partnership with GLSEN as we seek to support each and every one of you in doing that job.
So next steps. 1, don't allow CV in your schools. I can't say that. If that wasn't clear by my presentation, there's another packet also in there that details how the militarization of school systems, even before the introduction of the CVE program, has led to this state of constant fear where essentially students are walking into jail every day, and that's essentially the setup of schools in that regard. Next steps also too is about truly embracing inclusivity and diversity. And when we say embrace it, doesn't mean just hiring another Black teacher or hiring another Arab teacher. It means truly embracing it, and even beyond training materials. Often people just go to these diversity training seminars and they sit there for 3 hours and then they check a box, right? Teachers need to get intricately involved in community issues, right? When there is a small business issue that's occurring, that small business owner has probably 3 students, 2-3 students in your school, and they need your support in whatever issue they're going through, whether it's regarding tax increases or etc. that impacts them, because now they feel even more involved. Another aspect of inclusivity on a community level is also teachers being aware of the housing issues and epidemics that are occurring in their communities. Gentrification plays a huge role in how students perceive themselves and being welcomed and wanting to be there. Understanding that not every student also gets a warm meal every day. And so making sure you fight for those meal programs that are both during the school year and in the summer at certain facilities. Another next step, and I can go on about that, but another next step for that teachers can take as well is making sure you partner. And when I say partner, I don't mean just lawyers like myself, we don't really matter. It's really the people who have the most capital, and those people are the people who have the most to lose. So those stakeholders should be actual parents or actual educators that are your local college or university educators, right? And who have a need and an investment, right? They want your students to attend their college. Leverage that with increased programming, which exposes those students, whether they're students of color or different language accessibility issues, to a future. Right? They see something that's actually visible and feeling more inclusive in the community and development. And then lastly, of course, is just making sure you take an active role in curriculum issues. So many teachers, either because they don't have the power or because they just have too many students, are not involved in the actual decision making regarding curriculum. And that's important not only because of the context of the materials you're using to teach a diverse student body, but as I said, that there are larger institutional bias and structures put in place even in the materials we teach our students, and they reinforce these stereotypes. And helping to counteract that, ADC has been intricately involved in pushing implicit bias training, and it's not only for the white teacher, right? I also have bias, right? I was brought up and raised in a certain environment which preconceived biases, and so understanding those notions in everyday society, ranging not only from how the bus routes work and what part of towns they go to, play into how you perceive students coming into your classrooms, where they come from, where they live. And so that's very important. It's not just about stereotypes, it's about that implicit bias of how you judge people before they walk in. Thank you.
A couple of things. First off, educators are overworked and underpaid and understaffed, and thank you all for all that you all do, especially like coming out today on a lunch on a weekday, and those who are following it online, because that's extra commitment watching it online when you could be watching like ESPN or what have you. So thank you all for what you do, and for taking the time and the initiative to look into subjects such as this. The second thing is it's not enough to be reactive, right? Like this whole resistance movement, a lot of it seems to be based on reactionary politics and policies, right? Coming out to protest in response to something else, someone else doing something else. We need to be more proactive in our approaches to make sure that we're reaching the folks that we need to reach. And in that respect, a lot of attention and energy seems to be used up on even like the 1% of the minority and the underrepresented communities, right? Students in my situation and a lot of others who tend to be the more academically inclined, we end up getting a majority of the resources, scholarships, support, mentorships. And I definitely want to implore all educators and other allies of different organizations to make sure that we're not forgetting about the students who are maybe stuck in ESL for an extra year, who are not in those honor classes, who are going to community college and not like the 4-year private institutions, the recent arrivals who also need just as much, if not more, support than the rest of us who have already been acculturalized in one way or another, or who are fortunate enough to have both parents in our household and a stable life in one way or another, just to make sure that those are the communities that are going to be the most scared and feel like they have the less support out there, because we keep elevating these model minority stories, and they're strategic in a sense, but they also disempower the folks who are even more disempowered already if we keep doing that type of messaging and campaigning. So I definitely think that all of us, we need to reflect on what types of stories and such we want to elevate, and ensuring that our rhetoric doesn't criminalize the other parts of our communities, right? And this is something that, as an undocumented immigrant, we've learned a hard lesson. In 2010, our messaging was, it wasn't our fault that we came here. Then whose fault was it? We are implicitly blaming our parents for giving up everything and moving here to provide for us, right? So I think we just need to be more conscious of that. It's not always about meeting the messaging halfway, right? But we really need to reflect on that and ensure that we're reaching the folks who need to be reached. And to end it off, just making sure that we're also looking at the student and the families holistically. And that's something that I'm thankful that my wife, who's in the audience, Jennifer, she's always making sure that we're also talking about healthcare access. We're trying to make sure that in all of our presentations now we're talking about access to federally qualified health clinics, access to charity care, making sure that people know their rights, making sure that people know more than just the academics part of it, because these others, like you mentioned, like not everyone has access to food, right? Make sure they realize they might be eligible for food stamps, for SNAP, other resources that might be possible. So to go beyond just being diverse to doing diversity. I'm very proud that I come from Rutgers University in Newark, which has been the most diverse campus in the last 20 plus years. And our chancellor there has a really great motto of us trying to be an anchor institution, making sure that, we have our diversity numbers. And Rutgers University Newark is already looked at as like what campuses in 20 years will look like, that diverse. And I can tell you that it's still not enough. We're not doing enough diversity. We have silos of these different groups. We have our own biases even within our own minority populations. Within the Latino population, there's stuff between Mexicans, Peruvians, Ecuadorians, what have you. Making sure that in our classrooms we don't allow those stereotypes to go unchecked, those biases to go without notice, and making sure that all of those populations, and in particular the ones who don't speak up, who don't raise their hands, that they're the ones who honestly need the most attention and the most help. So if I leave you with anything, please just try to keep that in mind, and thank you all for all that you do. Albert Schenker Institute, Leo, Vicky, and everyone for having us.
Well, I want to close by thanking you, Giancarlo, and you, Yolanda, and you, Eliza, for really a fascinating conversation. And thank you also for the work that you are doing with Sleeves Rolled Up. As I reflect on the next steps for us, I think you've issued some challenges to the educators that work every day with families and kids. And, we are also, Giancarlo, trying to think about a proactive and not just a reactive agenda. And as you were speaking at the end there, I really started to think about our work around community schools. And whether it was, Eliza, your admonishment that every individual can do something to make a difference in the life of a child, which is a message that I think resonates with our members, to the issue of true diversity, Yolanda, that you brought up. We were with former Secretary of Labor Tom Perez today, and he said, it's not enough to invite folks to the dance. You got to dance with them. And I think I'll actually be back here in Washington next week, meeting with a group to talk about how we create greater diversity in our own profession and in our schools. And go ahead, Giancarlo.
One last thing. Unions make us all stronger, right? It's not enough for the undocumented community to get citizenship when we see things that need to be talked about, like Black Lives Matter. Super brief example, we needed to unionize someone's workforce who the majority factory were undocumented. And because of the union movement and organizers, now those workers all have access to healthcare for the first time and a stable wage and vacations. So I do want to say that, a piece of paper, whatever, a policy memorandum, it's not enough until you can actually, be able to take care of yourselves and your family, and the union does do that.
That's a great way to end. A commitment to strengthen our institutional alliances. Here's to that. Thank you all very much.
I just wanted to add, I'm so sorry. I think a testament is to this Arab and Muslim ban. As a result of it, there's been a broad coalition called No Ban, No Wall, No Raids, which touch upon cross immigration status, but also even African American brothers and sisters who have endured even walls and raids in their own communities. And so I think that has, reflected all the work that we have done.